Hey guys, tonight we grumble gently, dreamily, and in the oldest language known to human complaint. You're standing in the dusty cradle of civilization, toes sinking into warm, crumbly clay as the sleepy hum of ancient yore wraps around you. Looming ziggurats stretch lazily into a saffron sky, their steps catching the breeze off the Euphrates. The air smells faintly of wet earth, sheep dung, and some mild copper fraught. You're not here to build an empire or worship a moon god. No, you're here because someone 4,000 years ago got ripped off. And instead of muttering about it into his barley beer, he did what any reasonable Sumerian might do. He picked up his stylus and wrote what just might be the world's very first complaint letter. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Always curious how far this sleepy little time machine travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into the market district, the ground beneath your sandals warm with centuries of sun and soot. Flies hover lazily around camel carts, while copper ingots gleam under woven tents. This is your, sometime around 1750 BCE, place of canal water, cranky goats, and ambitious scribes. Somewhere, among the bustle, a man named Nanny is losing his mind over a very disappointing business transaction. But to understand why he ended up etching his fury into a clay tablet, you need to first understand where he was coming from, and what kind of world would make someone say, essentially, I demand a refund, and I'm telling the gods. Yor wasn't just some sleepy river town. It was one of the most powerful cities in ancient Sumer, with ziggurats looming like divine staircases and temple bureaucrats whose jobs were half sacred ritual, half glorified paperwork. If a goat sneezed too close to a holy courtyard, someone had to file that. If your neighbor's roof collapsed and flooded your barley stash, someone had to investigate. These people didn't invent writing because they loved poetry. They did it to keep receipts. Literally, so it makes perfect sense that the world's first recorded complaint would come from the same people who invented, well, almost everything boring but necessary. Taxes, bureaucracy, and standardized measurements of wheat. And here's the kicker: Nanny's not mad at some shadowy empire or invading horde. He's just mad at a merchant named Aenasser. Picture this: you walk for days to buy copper ingots, already a high-stakes move in an age before Venmo or even coins. When you arrive, sweaty and sunburnt, you find that the merchant not only gave you bad metal, but insulted your messengers and slammed the door in their faces. So what do? You grab a clay tablet, grab your most dramatic stylus, and say, essentially, I have had it with this copper clown. The tone is not mild. The Sumerian equivalent of "you have treated me with contempt" is carved so deeply into the clay you can almost hear the sighs. The letter survives today in the British Museum, officially known as a letter of complaint regarding delivery of inferior copper. But unofficially, it's the spiritual ancestor of all angry emails, all manager requests, all passive-aggressive one-star Yelp reviews. And Nanny did not hold back. But let's not judge him too quickly. Trade in the ancient world was not easy. Long donkey caravans hauled goods between cities that were weeks apart, through heat, bandits, and crooked middlemen. When a deal went bad, it wasn't just annoying, it could mean real losses, damaged reputations, or even divine punishment if you were seen as dishonest in temple-related transactions. In that context, writing it down, making it formal, was a big move. Writing meant permanence. Clay meant judgment. And if you squinted hard enough at the wedge-shaped cuneiform, maybe you could even pretend the gods were watching. Interestingly, historians still argue whether Nanny's letter was unique, or a part of a broader tradition. Was this a one-off tantrum, or just one of hundreds of clay complaints now lost to time? Some scholars think this was common practice, sort of official complaint protocol in cities where everyone had access to scribes and styluses. Others suggest it might have been rare, the equivalent of tweeting at the king because customer support ghosted you. We don't know for sure, but what we do know is that this little tablet has survived longer than the Tower of Babel, longer than Babylon itself, and definitely longer than whatever Refa Nanny was hoping to get. What makes this so oddly compelling is how modern it feels. He complains that his messengers were treated rudely, that the copper was subpar, that the merchant failed to honor previous deals. You can almost picture him sighing dramatically in his sandals, muttering to his friend, "This is exactly why I never deal with Aeonosaur." And yet, in the soft orange light of the Sumerian morning, it feels so distant, like a whisper echoing off mud brick walls. The letter, brittle and cracked, sits now under museum glass. Tourists shuffle past it without knowing that this tiny slab was once hot with outrage. It's quiet now, a relic of a man who once shouted with clay. So, as you nestle further into your pillow and the hum of night settles around you, keep this image in mind. Somewhere in ancient yore, a tired man dusts off his robes, squints at his tablet, and thinks that'll show him. Whether or not Aeonosaur ever read it well, that's something we'll get to in time. You continue drifting through the bustling clayandred alleyways of your where heat waves ripple off the streets like sighs from an overworked scribe. The air buzzes with the scent of roasting onions, sweaty livestock, and something suspiciously metallic, likely copper being smelted too close to the barley stands again. Here, in the grand city-state of your civilization, is loud, layered, and frankly, a little nosy. If the gods lived in the heavens, their accountants lived here, and they were always listening. You pause near a market gate, where reed mats hang in. The breeze and sellers call out prices in bored sing-song tones. Welcome to a world where complaint wasn't just a passing grumble, it was a civic ritual. You want to raise a fuss? You'd better do it properly. You'd better do it loud. Because in Sumerian culture, everything from grain storage to marriage contracts was recorded in clay. These people didn't gossip, they documented. And that meant every grumble could become a footnote in history, if written well enough. Let's zoom out a little. You're in southern Mesopotamia. Around 1750 BCE, the city of Oa, along with Uruk and Lagash, sits like a lazy crescent along the snaking rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates. These weren't small backwater towns, they were massive urban centers. For the time, complete with ziggurats, irrigation canals, and neighborhoods divided by profession. Over here, the scribes; over there, the potters; down that alley, the copper dealers and merchants, their goods stacked in sun-bleached rows. And yes, the noise. Despite our peaceful lull, this city is not quiet. Donkeys bray, children chase each other past temple courtyards, and merchants shout over one another in a sort of sleepy, sun-baked chaos. If there were ever a place primed for passive-aggressive rage, this was it. People lived practically on top of one another. Privacy was an illusion. And everyone owed something to someone: barley taxes to the temple, copper debts to a merchant, or a goat apology to your neighbor. You might expect a people this ancient to focus on loftier things: philosophy, astronomy, divine dreams. But no. Many Sumerians spent their time arguing over grain quantities and who shorted who on a shipment of wool. There's even a famous tablet that's just a grocery list with a note at the bottom: "Do not forget the garlic again." Some historians still chuckle over whether that line was sincere or the first documented instance of ancient sarcasm. But while the letter from Nanny may be the best-known formal complaint, it wasn't birthed in a vacuum. Sumerian cities operated on a sophisticated bureaucracy long before Caesar even had sandals. The temple complexes didn't just collect offerings, they tracked them. They stored records, dispensed rations, and oversaw contracts between citizens. That meant a constant churn of paperwork, or rather claywork. The scribes were elite professionals, trained from childhood to write wedge by wedge, line by line. If you had a grievance, odds are someone in the temple had a tablet ready to immortalize it. Here's a quirky detail. Temple scribes were so essential that they had their own patron deity, Nizaba, goddess of writing, grain, and accounting. Imagine praying to a divine bean counter before submitting your angry tablet. You had to choose your words carefully, not just for the merchant who wronged you, but for the celestial auditors who might read over your shoulder. In a sense, the city itself was designed to echo with complaints. Streets ran in tight, twisted loops, forcing neighbors into each other's business. Markets were loud, full of haggling and minor scams. If someone tried to sell you bad dates or weak beer, there wasn't an anonymous comment box, you simply shouted about it. Or, if you had the means and the grudge, you visited a scribe and dictated something immortal. Historians still argue whether complaints like Nanny's were commonplace or rare acts of social escalation. On one hand, the infrastructure clearly existed: scribes were everywhere, and temples loved record-keeping. On the other, the cost of materials, time, and training meant that not everyone could just file a clay complaint over lukewarm goat stew. That letter had weight, literal and metaphorical. And what about the system that received them? That, too, was a bit of a mess, but a structured mess. City governors, temple officials, and even merchant guilds played a role in sorting out disputes. Some complaints may have been read aloud in public squares. Others might have ended up in dusty temple archives, their sharp-edged words preserved for centuries in cool storage rooms. You can almost picture a tired scribe muttering, "Another angry one from Nanny. Great, that's 3 this week." Here's a strange thought. Some scholars think loud, formal complaining may have been seen as a virtue in Sumerian society. Not whiny, but assertive. A sign of someone who knew how to use the system. After all, a properly filed complaint wasn't just a tantrum, it was a demonstration of literacy, power, and poise. You didn't shout like a market fool. You commissioned a document. You made it last. And oh, how it lasted. The air is thick with time, as you imagine the soft squelch of wet clay under a stylus, the slow breath of a scribe repeating the words as he writes them. You can almost hear Nanny pacing behind him, arms crossed, listing every single injustice in painstaking detail. And another thing, my messenger was insulted. Write that down. Emphasize the insulted part. Sumerian cities were vibrant, complicated, and full of little grudges like these. If cities are built on dreams, they're also built on tiny disappointments, deliveries, unpaid debts, cracked pottery, and bad copper. And in this ancient land of mud brick walls and bureaucratic ambition, those complaints were carved to last. You brush your fingers against a sun-warmed wall as you pass the old merchant quarter, and you wonder, how many of those bricks once heard angry words? How many deals soured and were immortalized in cuneiform wedge marks? There's something comforting about knowing that even at the dawn of civilization, people still had bad customer service and wanted the world to know about it. You step quietly around a corner, your sandals crunching over scattered barley husks, until the scent of copper metallic and oddly sharp draws you toward a shaded stall beneath a sagging canopy. Imagine now, laid out on a table, not grain or dates or dried fish, but a clay tablet the size of your hand. It's cracked, worn, but unmistakably alive with tiny wedges pressed into its surface. This, dear listener, is the tablet that threw shade 4,000 years before shade was a thing. It's not a poem. It's not a legal contract. It's a full-on business roast, the oldest surviving complaint letter in recorded human history. Authored by a copper trader named Nanny, directed squarely at one poor Soleonosaur. Picture this man, Aonosaur, a name now echoing across time, as the first ever to receive an official "I'm disappointed in you" on record. What a legacy. The letter itself was written in Akkadian, using Sumerian cuneiform script, meaning it took a professional scribe and a careful hand to immortalize this moment of frustration. It reads something like this: You have not treated me with respect. I came to receive copper, and what you gave me was substandard. I sent messengers, and they were insulted. You have wronged me. If you squint, you can practically hear Nanny sighing and adding, also, your beard is weird, though unfortunately that part didn't survive. Here's the juicy part. The tablet was found not in a distant archive or buried under some forgotten palace, but in Aonosaur's actual home. That's right. It's as if you complained about someone in writing, sent them a fiery letter, and they just kept it in a drawer forever. And it's not the only one. Archaeologists uncovered several tablets there, many of which suggest that Aonosaur had a bit of a reputation for disappointing people. One could argue this man was the ancient world's answer to a very poorly rated eBay seller. Historians still argue whether Aonosaur was a singularly bad businessman, or just a typical merchant in a rough economy. Some suspect he was his way to profit buying lower grade copper from Dilmun and pawning it off on inland customers like Nanny. Others suggest Nanny was too picky, or that this whole drama was just the standard tension in any early supply chain. After all, transporting copper over hundreds of miles by donkey cart wasn't exactly prime shipping. Let's not overlook just how valuable copper was at the time. It wasn't just used for jewelry or status symbols, it was essential for tools, weapons, temple fittings, even plumbing. In a world that hadn't yet invented iron, copper was practically gold. And like all valuable things, its quality varied. Slag-filled ingots, brittle edges, impure color, all potential triggers for a very long clay tantrum. If you were running a temple workshop or outfitting a caravan, bad copper wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. Which brings us back to Nanny. You have to respect the sheer pettiness and patience it took to create this complaint. He didn't just yell, he didn't just curse. He took the time, energy, and resources to commission a formal, immortal record of his displeasure. A clay tablet takes hours to prepare and dry. The scribe's labor wasn't free. This wasn't a quick you-up message, it was more like "you dead to me." The tone of the letter is remarkable. It's formal, yes, but absolutely dripping with disdain. From the time you left until now, I have not received the copper, Nanny writes, his voice sharp even after centuries. You have treated my messenger with contempt. That word contempt rings like a tiny thunderclap in the stillness. You can almost hear the papyrus scrolls rustling in horror. And what did Aonosor do with this masterwork of passive aggression? Apparently, nothing. He filed it, left it on a shelf, let it age for 4 millennia in the warm silence of southern Iraq, which, in its own twisted way, makes him the most unbothered man in history. That, or he was so used to being complained about, it didn't even faze him. Oh, another tablet. Add it to the stack. Here's a quirky little wrinkle. Some experts believe Aonosor's residence was both his home and a sort of merchant office. The discovery of multiple tablets suggests he may have run a modest import-export operation right from his mud-brick living room. Which makes sense. Why rent office space when you can conduct international business between the family hearth and the goat pen? Still, there's something poetic about this particular tablet's survival. Of all the complaints written in history lost to fire, flood, indifference, this one endured. It outlived its author, his merchant rival, the entire Sumerian civilization. And maybe, just maybe, your latest Amazon return. Some scholars even debate whether this tablet's tone was intentionally performative. Was Nanny genuinely livid? Or was this a ritualized complaint? A formal gesture in a society that valued formality above catharsis? Was he hoping the letter would circulate, ruin Aonosor's reputation, or maybe even get picked up by a temple clerk for arbitration? We don't know. But the ambiguity adds to its weird magic. It's not just a complaint. It's a performance. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most Sumerian part of all this. In a society obsessed with order, record-keeping, and divine balance, putting your grievance in writing wasn't just personal. It was sacred. A way of reminding the universe that fairness still mattered, that dishonor had consequences, and that even the pettiest copper dealer was being watched by gods, scribes, and now museum-goers worldwide, as the sky over your softens into a hazy, peach-colored dusk. You wonder what Nanny would think if he knew his angry little tablet would one day sit under glass in London. Would he be satisfied, smug, or maybe just confused by the accents? Whatever the case, the tablet remains, a timeless, baked brick sigh, from one tired man to another. You wander now, through a sun-baked courtyard, its ground pitted with ancient footprints and wheel ruts, long hardened into the clay. Bronze clinks faintly in the distance, where an apprentice hammers dull copper into a brighter finish. You pause to watch because to really understand this feud between Nanny and Aonosor, You have to understand copper itself, and not just any copper, but Dilmun copper, the high-quality, status-boosting metal of ancient Sumerian dreams. C. In Nanny's world, copper wasn't just metal. It was mobility, power, prestige. You weren't just buying raw material, you were securing relationships, delivering promises, and upholding your name. Which makes the betrayal sting a bit more, doesn't it? When the copper is bad, everything's bad. You take a seat on a low stone bench near the trader's quarter and imagine yourself watching a caravan approach. Donkeys sway under heavy loads of bright metal, bundled in woven reed baskets, the straps cutting deep into their flanks. They've traveled overland for weeks from the Gulf, through sticky marshes and endless dust, following a path so old it predates even most gods' temples. This was the copper route from the island of Dilmun, now modern-day Bahrain, through Ur and the other Sumerian cities, and sometimes as far as Anatolia and Egypt. Dilmun copper was prized for its purity, its shine, and its near-mythic origin. Across the sea, it's what temples wanted for ritual tools, what artisans needed for blades and mirrors, what bureaucrats logged obsessively, counting ingots down to the last shekel weight. And like any hot commodity, it attracted ambitious merchants and occasional con men. Aonosaur operated right at this critical point in the supply chain. He imported copper from Dilmun and sold it inland to buyers like Nanny. It was a risky business. Ships could wreck, donkeys could die, and thieves were always waiting in the reeds. But it also meant profit margins fat enough to make a man like Aonosaur powerful, if he played it right, and sometimes he didn't. That's why the specific complaint from Nanny stings so much. Not just that the copper was low quality, but that it wasn't even ready when the messengers arrived. Imagine traveling for days across blistering plains, only to be told, sorry, the order's not in. Add insult to injury, and you've got the formula for history's first documented rage letter. Historians still argue whether Aonosaur was truly negligent or just a victim of overbooking. Some tablets suggest he had multiple orders stacked up, possibly over-promising to too many clients. Others hint that he might have knowingly pushed substandard copper to less important buyers, keeping the good stuff for bigger fish. It's the ancient version of reserving prime steaks for VIP customers while giving everyone else the mystery meat. Either way, Nanny wasn't having it. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Copper was so essential that the Sumerians sometimes referred to it as the flesh of the gods. Temples required it. Statues were cast from it. Even certain offerings had to be weighed out in copper instead of silver. And you'd better believe that if you delivered weak, brittle, or corroded ingots to a temple, your reputation wouldn't just suffer among clients. It might suffer in the eyes of heaven. That's what made Nanny's letter so bold. He wasn't just venting, he was exposing, making sure that Aonosaur's bad behavior was documented, witnessed, and perhaps punished. Because in Sumerian society, your name was your currency. You lost trust. You lost business. You lost offerings. You might even lose protection from the gods. You rise from the bench and walk past a row of storerooms, shadowy, cool, lined with ancient amphorae and baskets full of dull-colored metal. You imagine scribes pacing here, checking weights, recording transactions on little tablets with hushed voices. It's easy to forget just how sophisticated these trade systems were. There were receipts, return policies, formal delivery confirmations. Some contracts even had clauses that sound suspiciously like, if the item is damaged upon arrival. It's not so far removed from today's world of shipping delays and refund policies. The difference? They didn't email customer support. They walked miles and hired a guy with a stylus. You pause to consider the full absurdity. This entire copper economiso, essential to weapons, wheels and water pipes, balanced on the temperaments of a few key players. Merchants like Aeonosaur weren't just middlemen. They were influencers of infrastructure, if you will. And that made their mistakes sting just a little sharper. Here's a thought you didn't expect to be soothing. Copper wasn't even the only metal in circulation. Tin was traded too, mostly from Anatolia, but tin was rarer, and bronze made by combining copper and tin wasn't yet as widespread, so the stakes on copper deals were astronomically high. Temple economies could hinge on these deliveries, and when they went wrong, well, complaint tablets happened. And let's not ignore the very human side of this drama. Nanny wasn't just a businessman. He was someone who trusted a system. He probably offered blessings to the gods before departure, counted his ingots with care, and expected his messengers to return with pride. What he got instead? A dusty, broken promise, and bruised messengers with nothing to show. You wonder now whether Nanny ever did business again with Aeonosaur, if that tablet was his last word. Did others read the letter, whisper about it in the merchant quarters? Did Aeonosaur chuckle and say, "You think that's angry? You should have seen the tablet from Ishbiera last month." We'll never know, but as twilight paints the mud brick walls with amber shadows, you smile quietly, knowing this much. Even in the earliest days of trade and writing, people cared deeply about being wronged. They made it art. They made it eternal. And all over a pile of bad copper. The light fades a little more as you wind your way deeper into yours merchant quarter. The alleys narrowing, the air thickening with the scent of clay dust and old sweat. Somewhere nearby, a coppersmith hammers with a slow, sleepy rhythm. You pass rows of shuttered stalls and storage rooms, until you finally arrive at a small, unassuming workspace where a single low bench sits beside a reed basket of damp clay. This right here is where the real magic happened. Not in temples or courts, but in little corners like this, where words were carved with care, and grievances turned into history. Tonight, you've got front row access to one of the most human acts ever committed on clay. The act of dragging someone through bureaucratic mud, Sumerian style. Let's talk about how to roast a merchant in cuneiform. First off, cuneiform wasn't casual. It was deliberate. If you wanted to immortalize your fury, you had to really mean it. Picture a stylus made of reed, triangular at the end, pressed again and again into damp clay, until you built entire sentences out of tiny wedged impressions. No erasing, no whiteout, just a one-take chance at legacy. Nanny, as you know by now, did not hold back, his letter preserved miraculously for millennia delivers shade with the precision of a legal document and the saltiness of a snubbed restaurant review. The tone cordially furious, the language formal but weaponized. It's like he was writing for both a resolution and an audience. He starts strong. Tell Aeonosaur. Nanny sends the following message. A classic opening. Direct, no small talk. No hope you're well nonsense. just straight into the disappointment. You have not treated me with honor. He continues, before laying out exactly how and why. The copper, first and foremost, was substandard. The delivery, delayed. The treatment of his messenger, absolutely disgraceful. He even says that the servant you sent returned empty-handed twice. You can almost hear Nanny muttering in the background. Twice, Aonosaur, really. And here's a detail that adds a little sting. Nanny doesn't just complain about the copper. He also complains about having to cross enemy territory to try and get it. That's right, he risked bandits and border patrols to chase down copper, and still got nothing but bad service. Imagine traveling through a war zone to pick up a defective laptop. The full message reads, like a court deposition and a deeply personal vent session all at once. Scholars still argue over whether this was a standard format or a spicy one-off. Some suggest complaint letters like this were meant to be read publicly, or archived by city officials to maintain merchant accountability. Others think Nanny just wanted the satisfaction of seeing his fury immortalized in clay. Here's something even more fascinating. The phrase, "What do you take me for? That you treat me with such contempt," actually appears in the letter. Think about that. 4,000 years ago, someone wrote the equivalent of "Do you even know who I am?" in official script. It's weirdly comforting. Even at the dawn of civilization, people had egos and weren't afraid to flaunt them. In Times New Roman, or, in this case, wet clay bold, you lean in closer to the imagined tablet, picturing the scribe at work. Perhaps Nanny stood over him, pacing dramatically, offering edits and emphasizing certain words. Put contempt in bold, bold in cuneiform. The scribe, of course, just sighed and pressed harder. The structure of the letter also tells us something about Sumerian society. These weren't cavemen grunting at each other. This was a people who had developed a complex language system, understood nuance, and built an entire economy on documentation. The tone of the letter reflects social norms: formality, directness, and accountability. Cuneiform, in general, wasn't an easy script to master. It required years of schooling in Oedipus scribal schools run by temples or city-state institutions. Students copied legal codes, hymns, and market lists over and over. A complaint like Nanny's might have been crafted by one of these highly trained professionals, and the result? A complaint with all the elegance and precision of a marble sculpture. Sharp, solid, and a little passive-aggressive. And remember, this wasn't a throwaway letter. Clay tablets were meant to last. Once inscribed, the tablets were either dried in the sun or baked in kilns, making them nearly indestructible. Which means Nanny's rant is still readable today. It outlasted it outlasted Babylon, it outlasted floppy disks. But perhaps the most charming part of the whole affair is what the letter doesn't say. Nanny never threatens violence. He doesn't insult Aonosaur's family or suggest divine punishment. He keeps it formal, sharp, and surgical. It's a masterclass in civilized, furious version of a seething email with no typos. Sent in all lowercase, CCING, just the right people. That's the magic of it, isn't it? The idea that one furious merchant could step outside the chaos of his city, walk to a scribe, and immortalize his frustrations in perfect wedge-shaped script, that he believed in language, believed that documenting the offense gave it power. believed that even if he couldn't fix the deal, he could leave behind the clay echo of his indignation. You take a breath and look up at the star-flecked sky stretching over ancient yore. Somewhere in that distant black velvet, the moon god, Nana, watches silently from his temple. Below, mortals bicker over copper. They always have, they always will. Aonosaur operated right at this critical point in the supply chain. He imported copper from Dilmun and sold it inland to buyers like Nanny. It was a risky business. Ships could wreck, donkeys could die, and thieves were always waiting in the reeds. But it also meant profit margins fat enough to make a man like Aonosaur powerful. If he played it right, and sometimes he didn't. That's why the specific complaint from Nanny stings so much. Not just that the copper was low quality, but that it wasn't even ready when the messengers arrived. Imagine traveling for days across blistering plains, only to be told, sorry, the order's not in. Add insult to injury, and you've got the formula for history's first documented rage letter. Historians still argue whether Aonosaur was truly negligent or just a victim of overbooking. Some tablets suggest he had multiple orders stacked up, possibly over-promising to too many clients. Others hint that he might have knowingly pushed substandard copper to less important buyers, keeping the good stuff for bigger fish. It's the ancient version of reserving prime steaks for VIP customers, while giving everyone else the mystery meat. Either way, Nanny wasn't having it. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Copper was so essential that the Sumerians sometimes referred to it as the flesh of the gods. Temples required it. Statues were cast from it. Even certain offerings had to be weighed out in copper instead of silver. And you'd better believe that if you delivered weak, brittle, or corroded ingots to a temple, your reputation wouldn't just suffer among clients. It might suffer in the eyes of heaven. That's what made Nanny's letter so bold. He wasn't just venting, he was exposing, making sure that Aonosaur's bad behavior was documented, witnessed, and perhaps punished. Because in Sumerian society, your name was your currency. You lost trust. You lost business. You lost offerings. You might even lose protection from the gods. You rise from the bench and walk past a row of storerooms, shadowy, cool, lined with ancient amphorae and baskets full of dull-colored metal. You imagine scribes pacing here, checking weights, recording transactions on little tablets with hushed voices. It's easy to forget just how sophisticated these trade systems were. There were receipts, return policies, formal delivery confirmations. Some contracts even had clauses that sound suspiciously like, if the item is damaged upon arrival. It's not so far removed from today's world of shipping delays and refund policies. The difference? They didn't email customer support. They walked miles and hired a guy with a stylus. You pause to consider the full absurdity. This entire copper economiso, essential to weapons, wheels, and water pipes, balanced on the temperaments of a few key players. Merchants like Aonosaur weren't just middlemen. They were influencers of infrastructure, if you will. And that made their mistakes sting just a little sharper. Here's a thought you didn't expect to be soothing. Copper wasn't even the only metal in circulation. Tin was traded too, mostly from Anatolia, but tin was rarer, and bronze made by combining copper and tin wasn't yet as widespread, so the stakes on copper deals were astronomically high. Temple economies could hinge on these deliveries, and when they went wrong, well, complaint tablets happened. And let's not ignore the very human side of this drama. Nanny wasn't just a businessman. He was someone who trusted a system. He probably offered blessings to the gods before departure, counted his ingots with care, and expected his messengers to return with pride. What he got instead? A dusty, broken promise, and bruised messengers with nothing to show. You wonder now whether Nanny ever did business again with Aonosaur, if that tablet was his last word. Did others read the letter, whisper about it in the merchant quarters? Did Aonosaur chuckle and say, "You think that's angry? You should have seen the tablet from Ishbiera last month." We'll never know, but as twilight paints the mud brick walls with amber shadows, you smile quietly, knowing this much: even in the earliest days of trade and writing, people cared deeply about being wronged. They made it art, they made it eternal, and all over a pile of bad copper. The light fades a little more as you wind your way deeper into yours merchant quarter. The alleys narrowing, the air thickening with the scent of clay dust and old sweat. Somewhere nearby, a coppersmith hammers with a slow, sleepy rhythm. You pass rows of shuttered stalls and storage rooms, until you finally arrive at a small, unassuming workspace where a single low bench sits beside a reed basket of damp clay. This right here is where the real magic happened. Not in temples or courts, but in little corners like this, where words were carved with care, and grievances turned into history. Tonight, you've got front row access to one of the most human acts ever committed on clay. The act of dragging someone through bureaucratic mud, Sumerian style. Let's talk about how to roast a merchant in cuneiform. First off, cuneiform wasn't casual. It was deliberate. If you wanted to immortalize your fury, you had to really mean it. Picture a stylus made of reed, triangular at the end, pressed again and again into damp clay, until you built entire sentences out of tiny wedged impressions. No erasing, no whiteout, just a one-take chance at legacy. Nanny, as you know by now, did not hold back. His letter, preserved miraculously for millennia, delivers shade with the precision of a legal document and the saltiness of a snubbed restaurant review. The tone cordially furious, the language formal but weaponized. It's like he was writing for both a resolution and an audience. He starts strong. Tell Aonosaur. Nanny sends the following message. A classic opening. Direct, no small talk. No hope you're well nonsense. Just straight into the disappointment. You have not treated me with honor. He continues, before laying out exactly how and why. The copper, first and foremost, was substandard. The delivery, delayed. The treatment of his messenger, absolutely disgraceful. He even says that the servant you sent returned empty-handed twice. You can almost hear Nanny muttering in the background. Twice, Aonosaur, really. And here's a detail that adds a little sting. Nanny doesn't just complain about the copper. He also complains about having to cross enemy territory to try and get it. That's right, he risked bandits and border patrols to chase down copper, and still got nothing but bad service. Imagine traveling through a war zone to pick up a defective laptop. The full message reads, like a court deposition and a deeply personal vent session all at once. Scholars still argue over whether this was a standard format or a spicy one-off. Some suggest complaint letters like this were meant to be read publicly, or archived by city officials to maintain merchant accountability. Others think Nanny just wanted the satisfaction of seeing his fury immortalized in clay. Here's something even more fascinating. The phrase, "What do you take me for? That you treat me with such contempt," actually appears in the letter. Think about that. 4,000 years ago, someone wrote the equivalent of "Do you even know who I am?" in official script. It's weirdly comforting. Even at the dawn of civilization, people had egos and weren't afraid to flaunt them. In Times New Roman, or, in this case, wet clay bold, you lean in closer to the imagined tablet, picturing the scribe at work. Perhaps Nanny stood over him, pacing dramatically, offering edits and emphasizing certain words. Put contempt in bold, bold in cuneiform. The scribe, of course, just sighed and pressed harder. The structure of the letter also tells us something about Sumerian society. These weren't cavemen grunting at each other. This was a people who had developed a complex language system, understood nuance, and built an entire economy on documentation. The tone of the letter reflects social norms, formality, directness, and accountability. Cuneiform, in general, wasn't an easy script to master. It required years of schooling in Oedipus scribal schools run by temples or city-state institutions. Students copied legal codes, hymns, and market lists over and over. A complaint like Nanny's might have been crafted by one of these highly trained professionals, and the result? A complaint with all the elegance and precision of a marble sculpture. Sharp, solid, and a little passive-aggressive. And remember this wasn't a throwaway letter. Clay tablets were meant to last. Once inscribed, the tablets were either dried in the sun or baked in kilns, making them nearly indestructible. Which means Nanny's rant is still readable today. It outlasted it outlasted Babylon, it outlasted floppy disks. But perhaps the most charming part of the whole affair is what the letter doesn't say. Nanny never threatens violence. He doesn't insult Aonasser's family or suggest divine punishment. He keeps it formal, sharp, and surgical. It's a masterclass in civilized, furious version of a seething email with no typos. Sent in all lowercase, CCING, just the right people. That's the magic of it, isn't it? The idea that one furious merchant could step outside the chaos of his city, walk to a scribe, and immortalize his frustrations in perfect wedge-shaped script. That he believed in language. Believed that documenting the offense gave it power. Believed that even if he couldn't fix the deal, he could leave behind the clay echo of his indignation. You take a breath and look up at the star-flecked sky stretching over ancient yore. Somewhere in that distant black velvet, the moon god, Nana, watches silently from his temple. Below, mortals bicker over copper. They always have, they always will. You drift now past the ancient warehouses, your steps soft against the beaten clay road, until you find yourself once again outside the house of Anassor. It's a modest structure by modern standards, mud brick walls, browned by centuries of sun, narrow doorways barely shoulder-width apart, and storage rooms that once overflowed with copper ingots, trade records, and, apparently, unhappy customer feedback. Yes, this is the house. The same one where that little tablet of shade was. Found where Nanny's grievances were delivered, likely by hand, and where a pattern seems to have emerged. Because, as archaeologists discovered, Nanny may not have been alone. There were more complaint tablets, more grumpy customers, more tiny wedge-filled testimonials saying, "This guy, not great." Historians still argue whether Aenosor was just unlucky to have his dirty laundry preserved so thoroughly, whether he was genuinely Mesopotamia's worst merchant. Some argue in his defense. Copper supply chains were complex, and regional shortages could cause delays. Others point out that the sheer volume of complaints found at his house paints a less than glowing picture. It's like finding 1,000 negative reviews pinned to someone's garage and thinking, maybe there's something to this. The image of Aenosor emerging from his home, arms crossed, refusing to speak to another red-faced courier is both hilarious and oddly relatable. You can imagine him groaning, "Ooh, another one," before tossing the tablet into the corner and going back to inspecting his ingots. In this way, he becomes the ancient equivalent of a stubborn vendor with a 2.3-star rating and no interest in improving it. And yet here's the twist: he kept the tablets. They were found on site. Not smashed, not buried in shame, just there, stacked with other business records. This has led to a curious debate in the scholarly world. Did Aenosar simply not care? Was he unfazed by the shade? Or did he view these tablets as part of the job, an expected volume of paperwork, like modern-day customer service forms filed away and quickly forgotten? One fringe theory even suggests that he might have kept them for legal protection. After all, having a complaint on record could work both ways. Ah yes, he might say to a temple clerk, "Nanny's angry again. Here's his last letter. See, I've done nothing wrong. It's all there. Read it." Another theory, which feels suspiciously like retroactive reputation rehab, suggests Aenosor was actually the victim. That perhaps Nanny was a particularly aggressive client, and the complaints were overblown. That poor Aenosor was doing his best in a brutal economy, dealing with shipping delays, storage issues, and caravan theft. That this whole thing is just ancient PR gone sideways. But, come on. When multiple tablets say your messengers are being insulted, and that your copper is not fine and not what was promised, it starts to look a little less like coincidence and more like a pattern. Especially when the name Aenosor keeps popping up in other trade documents, always attached to some sticky situation or tense negotiation. He might not have been evil, but he almost certainly was exhausting. Here's a quirky little gem. One of the tablets from his house includes a list of copper weights and measurements that don't seem to match up with standard temple records. Was he skimming, mixing good copper with scraps, or just bad at math? We'll never know. But it adds a faint whiff of suspicion to the whole affair. And while we're here, let's appreciate how modern all of this feels. The idea that someone would consistently frustrate clients, ignore feedback, and yet keep running their business like nothing happened. That's not ancient, that's corporate. But the real magic is in the small moments. Imagine the couriers arriving dust-covered, sweating, clutching little satchels of copper, only to be brushed off or told the deal had changed. Then trudging back to Nanny, rehearsing the bad news the whole way. Okay, I'll start with the insult part, then the missing copper. You can almost hear the tired sighs, the muttered curses. You can feel the tension brewing, not just over goods, but over respect. In a society where honor and social standing were everything, being treated with contempt, as Nanny wrote, wasn't just business. It was personal. Even the way the complaints were phrased suggests this. You have not honored your word. You treat my messengers poorly. These weren't just about damaged products, they were about damaged dignity. And that's what makes Aeonosaur such an oddly compelling figure. He's not a villain in the traditional sense. He's not pillaging cities or raising armies. He's just kind of a jerk at work. A man caught in the gears of the earliest bureaucracy. Maybe cutting corners, maybe in over his head. The Sumerian Larry from accounting. If Larry also imported metal and had no sense of customer service, you imagine him now, reclining on a low wooden bench in his courtyard, squinting at the horizon. His copper stores glint in the sun. Inside, another courier is waiting. Another complaint is being etched. He knows it, but he doesn't move. Maybe he's already decided. Tablets are cheap. His pride is not. And so the letters keep coming. The complaints keep piling up. And somewhere, far away, Nanny picks up another tablet, shakes his head, and says, "Fine, I'll write another one." The two men never see eye to eye, but in some strange way, they've both become immortal, trapped forever in a dusty feud written in clay. You walk slowly now, beneath a crumbling archway, where time itself seems to settle like dust on your shoulders. Beyond it lies the daily hum of ancient Sumernaught, its kings or gods, but its regular people, trudging through an average day. And as it turns out, average days in Sumer were full of little miseries, petty annoyances, and yes, plenty of reasons to grumble. See, Nanny's complaint letter wasn't birthed in a vacuum. It came from a culture where frustration was a way of life. Whether it was scorching heat, goat-related chaos, or bureaucratic temple scribes that made you wait for hours to notarize a grain receipt, there was always something. And when life is just a rolling parade of micro-irritations, sometimes all you can do is mutter angrily and carve your vengeance into clay. You duck past a reed awning and step into a courtyard filled with the sounds of early morning crowing, pots clanking, a woman yelling at a lazy servant who's clearly pretending not to hear. There's laughter too, but it's tired laughter, the kind that bubbles out between chores. Life here is vivid and loud, but far from peaceful. Take the weather, for example. Sumer was no tropical paradise. The climate swung wildly, either too dry or suddenly flooded. Crops were unpredictable. Mud brick homes melted slightly every rainy season and needed constant patching. Imagine sleeping in a room that smells like damp clay and goat hair, only to wake up to news that a neighbor's sewage canal has overflown into your barley store. You're not exactly whistling your way through the morning. And then there were the animals. Sumerian cities were full of them. Goats, oxen, donkeys, and pigs mingled freely with humans, often in homes or narrow alleys. You haven't lived until a disgruntled goat has eaten your laundry and headbutted your child into a cart full of onions. Fun fact, one surviving Sumerian tablet includes a list of temple inventory that specifically deducts one goat, extremely aggressive. So yes, even the gods weren't safe. Then you had the divine bureaucracy. Every major Sumerian city revolved around a temple complex, which acted like city hall, tax office, and spiritual hotline all in one. Need to buy land? Go to the temple. Need to record your marriage contract? Temple again. Need to complain about your neighbor's snoring? Also temple, though possibly not high on their to-do list. Temple scribes were the unsung heroes and silent villains of this system. Trained from a young age, they spent their lives pressing wedge-shaped symbols into wet clay, documenting everything from religious hymns to lost sheep, and they were always busy. Filing a complaint meant waiting your turn, bribing someone with a loaf of sesame bread, and hoping the scribe didn't accidentally miswrite your enemy's name to sound like Donkey Face. This endless dance of complaint and delay is why some scholars believe the complaint letter wasn't just a practical step, it was a social ritual, a formal way of acknowledging frustration in a society obsessed with recording. You didn't just yell at someone in the street. You composed a careful tablet. You named names. You made it official. Historians still debate just how performative these complaints were. Were they truly expected to be resolved? Or were they part of an ancient venting system in emotional filing cabinet to make yourself feel heard, even if nobody ever responded? There's no evidence that Anasar replied to Nanny. After all, maybe he didn't need to. Maybe Nanny knew that, and still felt better once it was etched into clay. Here's a fringe tidbit you didn't ask for but now definitely need. Among Sumerian curses, one of the milder but more poetic ones went something like, "May your barley be full of pebbles." That's the kind of irritation we're talking about. Not apocalyptic revenge. Just a solid dose of everyday spite. Even the gods themselves weren't above complaint. One hymn recovered from a temple archive includes the line, "O Enlil, why have you let my field wither?" Another, believed to be written by a desperate farmer, laments, "The rain listens to others but not to me." You can practically hear the eye roll. Divine worship in Sumer wasn't always reverent, it was often transactional. I gave you 10 goats and a barley cake. Where's my rain, Enlil? So, when Nanny picked up his stylosaur, more likely dictated to someone who did, he wasn't doing something radical. He was continuing a tradition. A proud, squinty-eyed, slightly sweaty tradition of saying, "This is not okay." You walk on, and the noises of the street rise and fall around you. A fishmonger shouts at a boy for stepping in his slop pile. A priest's assistant haggles with a potter over the cost of incense jars. A dog barks at nothing. It's a world in motion, held together by scribes and sandals and the thin string of shared annoyance. You pass a small tablet, vendor, yes, that was a jaband. Imagine him gesturing proudly to a stack of fresh clay rectangles. Perfect for threats, lawsuits, or letters to your sister, he says. Limited cracking, smooth finish, no wormholes. A shopper inspects one, nods, and says, "Do you have one that's extra angry, and why not?" Even the medium itself, tablet, feels like part of the mood. Heavy, firm, durable. When you write your complaints in clay, you're not hoping they vanish. You're hoping they last. You're hoping anyone will read them and think, "Yeah, this guy got treated unfairly." So you see, Nanny wasn't just upset about bad copper. He was speaking into a world already trained to listen to complaint, to hold it, to dignify it with formality and permanence. His words weren't shouted. They were whispered across centuries, with each tiny wedge like a heartbeat of frustration. And you're still listening. You wander now into the temple quarter, where the scent of warm oil, incense, and dried papyrus lingers in the narrow halls. Here, past courtyards and processional paths, lies the quiet beating heart of Sumerian paperwork, the scribal chambers. These weren't majestic or showy, just cool rooms with shelves of clay tablets stacked like ancient filing cabinets. Attended by scribes whose entire lives were spent translating chaos into order, one wedge at a time. You're standing in what might be considered the world's first administrative inbox, a place where prayers, taxes, rations, contracts, and yes, complaints, were all recorded with stunning precision. And not just recorded, but sorted, stored, and often responded to. Which brings us to a soothing, strangely satisfying truth. The ancient world had paperwork. It had follow-up. It even had the bureaucratic equivalent of "we've received your message and will get back to you shortly." Of course, not all responses were prompt or even legible. Some scribes were brilliant. Others had, let's just say, generous interpretations of grammar. But the temple complex of yore was built on systems. There were roles for complaint intake. There were recorders. There were clerks who copied letters line for line for royal archives. Even messengers had rank. This was a society where every shipment, insult, and unpaid temple tax could be pressed into clay and passed along the official chain like the world's slowest email. You find a quiet corner beside a scribal desk, really, just a low polished board resting on brick supports, and picture a young student practicing characters in the soft evening light. He writes, rewrites, wipes the clay, begins again. Eventually, he'll graduate to the real stuff, recording land transactions, dowries, and yes, angry merchants calling out dodgy dealers like Ea-Nasser. In fact, that's the marvel of it. The complaint from Nanny wasn't an outburst, it was a process. He didn't just scrawl something and hope for justice. He submitted it into a system. And that system, however creaky, had structure. There was protocol for sending complaints up to temple authorities. Some even made it to palace officials, especially if a complaint threatened wider trade relationships. Historians still debate the exact hierarchy of these records. Did all complaints get reviewed by temple economists? Were there specific scribes who handled grievance letters, the way today's offices have HR departments and legal liaisons? One theory suggests that a scribe's clay inbox might have included not only messages from individuals like Nanny, but reports from tax collectors, temple suppliers, and regional governors. What's clear, though, is that scribes weren't just neutral recorders. They could influence how a complaint was interpreted, how it was worded, which parts were emphasized. After all, you were dictating to them, and a well-connected scribe might smooth over your tone, or sharpen it, if you asked nicely. Here's a fun fringe detail. Some tablets show signs of being recarved or copied, meaning a complaint might have gone through drafts. Imagine sitting with your scribe and saying, "No, that part about the messenger, make it sound more dramatic." He didn't just return empty-handed, he returned humiliated and hungry. Yes, put hungry and just think. These weren't emails. These were slabs of clay. Physical, weighty, utterly permanent. They weren't filed away quietly. Some might have been read aloud in front of temple officials, or stored for audits. You can almost picture a high priest sighing as another clay tablet clunks onto his desk, thinking, "Ugh, what's Ea-Nasser done this time?" The fact that We've recovered so many of these documents speaks to how meticulous the temple bureaucracy was. These weren't scribbles in the sand. They were baked, preserved, and shelved. The same way we store legal contracts or corporate records today. And while it's tempting to romanticize it, the truth is, it was often just tedious. There's a certain comfort in that. Knowing that ancient people dealt with annoying paperwork. That their inboxes overflowed. That they, too, probably had a backlog of unread tablets from that one guy who always had a problem. It's possible that Aonosser's bad copper incident did generate an internal investigation. Maybe a temple official summoned him. Maybe not. But the letter survived, and so did the system that accepted it. The slow clay gears of Mesopotamian bureaucracy turned for millennia. Fueled by barley ink and righteous indignation, and the best part, people believed in it. Nanny believed his voice mattered not just because he was angry, but because he knew where to take it. He trusted that if he followed the ritual formal language, proper delivery, official tone, his complaint would carry weight. That's powerful. In a world without phones, social media, or even paper, people still found a way to say, "This isn't right, and I want someone to know." You shift your weight on the temple bench and run your fingers lightly across a forgotten tablet edge, still sharp after 4,000 years. It's just a few centimeters wide, but it holds someone's story etched permanently, never deleted. Maybe it's a receipt. Maybe it's a hymn. Or maybe it's another merchant, long lost to time, saying, "Excuse me, but this goat was defective." Even now, the stone walls seem to hum with soft echoes, words written in clay and whispered forward across centuries. Bureaucratic, yes. Tedious, certainly, but also strangely beautiful. Because through all the mess, the mud, and the donkey's courtyards, people believed their words could matter. And some, like Nanny's, really did. You glance down again at that baked clay tablet. There it sits, just over 8 inches wide, its surface scrawled in tiny, painstaking wedge marks the Sumerian complaint letter that's traveled millennia to land here in your sleepy hands. But something about the way it's written tells you this wasn't just a one-time temper tantrum. No, this was formulaic, intentional, part of a larger system. And to make sense of it, you'll have to take a detour into the strange, bureaucratic theater of ancient Mesopotamian formal complaints. Yes, even 4,000 years ago, people had paperwork. So let's talk structure. The letter from Nanny to Aonos isn't just a string of angry thoughts. It follows a pattern. It opens with a greeting, though a frosty one. Then, like a bureaucratic sandwich, it layers in references to prior agreements, records the botched delivery, elaborates on the insult, and finally asks for redress. In fact, it's a bit like the world's first customer service escalation email. Dear Sir, as per my previous message, I am once again expressing my dissatisfaction. This structure didn't emerge from nowhere. In Sumer letter writing was a highly respected craft. Most citizens couldn't write at all. Scribes trained for years to master cuneiform. The wedge-shaped system carved into clay with a reed stylus. To put something in writing was not casual. It was binding. It was sacred. So, writing a complaint, that meant serious business. Historians still argue whether this kind of letter had any real legal power. Some believe the complaint served more as a warning, a way of pressuring the merchant through reputational risk. Others think it might have functioned like a proto-lawsuit, potentially triggering a hearing before temple authorities. Either way, it wasn't just ranting. This was strategic communication, complete with structure, tone, and consequences. And believe it or not, the Sumerians weren't just rigid old record keepers. They had complaint genres. For example, there were formulaic temple complaints, where citizens could air grievances against officials who mismanaged offerings or neglected religious duties. Imagine walking into a temple and lodging a formal objection because someone left the incense burner unpolished, or clay tablets complaining about corrupt tax collectors, a favorite target of frustration in every society since dawn broke over civilization. Now, if you were lodging a formal complaint in Sumer, you had to get the tone just right. Not to humble, then no one would take you seriously. Not to hostile, or the gods might get involved, and not in your favor. So writers leaned into clever phrasing, rhetorical questions, and even sarcasm. Sound familiar? Nanny's letter drips with passive-aggressive flair. It's not you cheated me. It's you told my messenger something, then did another thing entirely. That kind of precise phrasing makes it hard to argue back. And while you lie there, eyes fluttering, your brain might be spinning around the idea of Sumerian tone. What did passive-aggressive sound like in cuneiform? Probably a little like this: because you did not do what you promised. I have come in person, and still I have received nothing. There's a rhythm to it, a pacing. You can almost hear Nanny pacing too, waiting for the next boat, rehearsing his lines, fuming into the wind as his copper rusts. But let's zoom out. This level of detail and structure in a complaint letter implies that there were social expectations around fairness, around business conduct, around how to treat one another even if copper bars and messengers were involved. A complaint was more than a shout into the void. It was a coded signal that the social contract had been broken, and the person on the other end had better fix it or lose standing. There's also the fascinating little fact that many letters of complaint, not just Nanny's, have survived. So clearly, this wasn't a one-off incident. Sumerian archives have revealed numerous documents where merchants complain about weights being rigged, grain being under-delivered, or laborers not showing up. It was like the Better Business Bureau, but with clay and sandals. And here's a quirky twist. Sometimes these complaint tablets were found stored alongside ledgers and receipts, suggesting they were considered part of the transactional record. It's like stapling your one-star Yelp review to your invoice and filing it under accounts payable. Formalized complaining was just another thread in the fabric of business. One particularly odd letter found at your involves a complaint about stolen fish. Yes, fish. Apparently, a shipment of dried fish, important protein in the Mesopotamian diet, was intercepted, and the sender wanted answers. The language is almost comically bureaucratic. You stated you would send 5 netfuls of dried fish. Upon opening the parcel, we found only 3 netfuls. The gods know. The gods always knew. And if they didn't, the scribes made sure they found out. The beauty of the complaint format was that it allowed the writer to make a record not just for their opponent, but for the community. If someone kept winding up in letters like this, their reputation soured. Other merchants might refuse to deal with them. It was social regulation without social media. Though the petty energy was eerily similar, historians still debate whether scribes composed these letters for others, or if some traders could write them independently. Given the precision of the script and the adherence to formula, most believe scribes were hired for the job, which means there were likely entire offices of complaint writers, ancient equivalents of customer advocates with styluses instead of keyboards. You walk in angry. You walk out with a clay tablet and a cathartic sense of justice. And justice, after all, was a major concern in Sumerian society. The Code of Yernamu, predating Hammurabi's more famous law code, lays out a system of penalties, weights, and values intended to keep trade honest. So, while there's no record of Anasaur being dragged to court over Nanny's fury, it's entirely plausible that someone, somewhere, paid a price for cheating. So tonight, as your mind floats between old cities and the soft pillow beneath, you imagine this: a world where the power of a single clay tablet could echo across rivers, settlements, and centuries. A world where structure, tone, and clever indignation gave even the humblest trader a voice. You smile, eyes heavy now, knowing that in the sleepy dust of history, someone once shook their fist politely, precisely, and permanently. You linger a moment longer in the back rooms of the Ekur Temple Library, brushing your fingers along the brittle edges of baked clay tablets, when something strange pops up. Not another accounting tally, not a religious hymn, but a peculiar kind of formal writing, half poetry, half performance, and all complaint. This is AMA Oglatum, the literary complaint letter. Think Yelp review, but from 4,000 years ago, etched carefully into wet mud, and addressed to a god or a king or sometimes even a merchant. And yes, while most were solemn affairs, some got surprisingly spicy. Tonight, you're curling up with what many scholars agree is the world's oldest known written complaint, the Tablet of Eas, not ear. You squint at the lines. It's not just any customer feedback. It's a scathing, passive-aggressive rant from a man named Nanny, who is not pleased about his copper delivery. In fact, you could almost hear the huffy sighs as he dictated it. Nanny essentially says, "I came all this way, risked my neck in your terrible town, and this is the garbage copper you give me. And you won't even talk to my messenger. What is this? Babylonian customer service?" This tablet survives today in the British Museum and has been memed mercilessly online. Possibly the only time a cuneiform clay slab has gone viral. And yes, there's debate about whether this was a one-off or part of a wider culture of formalized complaint writing. Historians still argue whether such letters were a tool for actual resolution or more of a reputation weapon, something you'd circulate among peers to warn others. Avoid Aeon Ear, the copper guy with attitude. But it gets better. You dig through other similar texts and realize the genre had variety. Some were addressed directly to the gods. "O Shamash, God of justice, why do you let my neighbor steal my goats?" Others read more like self-pitying poems. "Woe to me, for I am mocked by the very people who once shared my barley." One tablet complains about a boat that broke before reaching port, another about workers who don't show up, another even blames fate for a run of bad crops, and subtly hints the gods have been napping on the job. It's like a Mesopotamian complaint box, got stuffed with both corporate HR memos and dramatic one-star reviews. And all of it was replies. You couldn't just rant like someone on a forum. You had to use proper formats, epistolary greetings, structured arguments, and respectfully insert at least one groveling line about how the recipient is wise, noble, and probably smells better than incense. Now picture a scribe patiently carving this into clay while the angry merchant paces behind him, muttering curses under his breath and maybe stealing a handful of dates off the office tray. You kind of feel bad for the scribe. Yes, Nanny, I'm on line 47 of your insult. No, I haven't finished listing all the ways EA not ear has failed you. Please stop breathing down my neck. Some scholars wonder if the complaint letters were also teaching tools models for scribes to practice persuasive language, emotional manipulation, or formal grievance structure that would make them the earliest version of legalese, where outrage gets translated into procedural elegance. Other researchers argue these letters were actual legal submissions to be read by elders or merchants' councils, sort of like a trial by tablet. No need to yell. Just drop your clay bomb in the suggestion box and wait. And remember, clay tablets didn't vanish. Unlike modern paper, these were baked to last, so if you messed up and your customer immortalized your failure in fired mud, congratulations, your bad day just got preserved for 4 millennia. A business blunder that echoes through the ages. That's legacy, baby. But here's a quirky tidbit. Not all complaints were serious. One surviving fragment from the Old Babylonian period is believed to be a parody. It mimics the high-stakes language of formal grievance but complains about something absurd, possibly goats that refuse to dance, or neighbors who chew too loudly. Scholars can't quite agree on the translation, but the tone is clearly satirical. Even back then, people liked to poke fun at bureaucracy. It's this mix of human grumpiness, poetic structure, and divine appeals that makes Mesopotamian complaint letters so strange and oddly comforting. You realize that despite 4,000 years of technological evolution, the emotional content of human dissatisfaction hasn't changed much. Nanny and a disgruntled Starbucks customer today would probably get along just fine. They'd bond over their mutual betrayal and maybe write a co-authored clay tablet titled Do Better, EAAA. Not ear, and if you're imagining yourself sending one of these letters, you're not alone. Some modern museums offer workshops where visitors make their own clay complaint tablets, using styluses and replica Akkadian script. It's deeply therapeutic, apparently. Plus, it really makes you appreciate the effort it took to be petty in ancient times. No keyboard, no delete button, just a lump of clay and your righteous indignation. So now, as you exhale into the flickering candlelight of your sleepy palace, picture Nanny walking away from An-Ear's door, fuming, clutching his rubbish, copper, and mentally drafting the angriest cuneiform letter the ancient world has ever known. You blink slowly in the dim torchlight of an imagined archive, the dust in the air heavy with the scent of ancient parchment. Somewhere behind you, a clay tablet clicks quietly into its storage niche, the way a well-loved book might slide back into its shelf. You've just watched the world's oldest customer complaint get fired off like a passive-aggressive email, and now, here's the twist. The tablet wasn't just a one-off venting session. Nope. This wasn't some prehistoric Yelp review written in the heat of the moment. This was part of something far bigger, stickier, and, yes, leapier. Welcome to the thrilling world of Mesopotamian administrative bureaucracy. UC. Once the Sumerians realized they could preserve communication in hardened clay, they didn't just stop at receipts and rants. Oh no, they leaned in hard. What followed was the birth of a complex paperwork culture that would leave even modern HR departments blushing. That complaint letter from Nanny to Aeonosaur. It fit neatly into a much larger system of bureaucratic exchange, one that tracked inventory, delivery schedules, contracts, labor, and, perhaps most amusingly, how often someone failed to show up for their barley rations. Historians still argue whether this bureaucratic sprawl evolved purely from necessity or from a cultural obsession with record-keeping. Some suggest that Sumerian society simply grew so dense, so reliant on systems of temple management, land distribution, and taxation that without written documents, chaos would have reigned. Others argue it was more about control than order. Scribes and temple officials could maintain power simply by holding the receipts, so to speak. Either way, the result was a network of tablets so detailed and wide-ranging that it makes modern DMV lines seem positively efficient. And because you're curious, tired, slightly amused, you start to imagine what this system looked like in action. A delivery cart loaded with copper ingots rattles toward a temple storehouse. Beside it trudges a junior scribe with an armful of wet clay tablets, muttering to himself because the previous clerk didn't follow the correct entry format again. He's got styluses tucked behind each ear like pens, and a small bag of sand to dry the tablets faster. His day will be long, his hands will cramp, and someone will inevitably misplace a consignment tag, causing an interdepartmental spat that drags on for weeks. The bureaucratic culture was so embedded, in fact, that certain scribal schools began teaching not just how to write, but how to write correctly, beautifully, and according to protocol. That's right, there were formal templates, training tablets, and even pre-written boilerplate complaints. Copying out model letters became part of the curriculum. The oldest how to file a complaint manual may well have been passed down between generations of overworked apprentices, all of whom desperately wished for something more exciting, like grain, quota calculations. And it wasn't just commercial complaints. There were disputes over boundaries, debts, broken contracts, and temple obligations. Imagine a temple priest trying to dodge his duty roster by claiming he didn't receive the proper summons, and the poor scribe being forced to fetch last season's clay to prove otherwise. Or a farmer complaining that his ox was stolen during transit, even though the inventory tablet clearly stated to oxen left the village and to arrived. What happened in between? A mystery only half-baked clay could hope to solve. Here's the kicker. All these documents had to be stored. And unlike digital files that can be stacked 1,000 deep into invisible folders, these were physical, chunky, and heavy. Temples and administrative buildings began dedicating entire rooms tablet libraries to archive them. Some were arranged by topic, others by year, others by who could reach the highest shelf without a stool. And God's help you if you miss something, because the head scribe would probably recite a 200-line curse from memory about carelessness and dishonor. One quirky but very real detail. Some tablets came with baked-in clay envelopes. Yes, that's right, a tablet within a tablet. You'd write your letter, seal it in another clay slab, then stamp the outer shell with a cylinder seal, a kind of signature. If someone tried to tamper with it. They'd have to smash the outer shell, leaving behind undeniable evidence. It was the Mesopotamian equivalent of reading someone's texts and not being able to mark them unread. The drama now pause for a moment. Really pause. Let the sheer absurdity of this bureaucratic commitment lull you. Think of a scribe leaning over his desk, candlelight flickering, trying to recall whether this particular delivery of sheep intestines fell under temple donation or medical requisition. He dips his stylus in water, adjusts his clay, and sighs. Somewhere, another scribe is writing a complaint about the previous complaint not being copied in triplicate. It's a world of small grievances carved into stone, and it is somehow deeply, profoundly calming. What all this shows beyond the dusty humorists, how the Sumerians' obsession with structure mirrored the rhythms of their life. Their cities pulsed with order, temples, trade routes, irrigation channels, star charts. Their complaints weren't side notes. They were foundational. Without them, the gears of early civilization might have seized up entirely, in a way. Nanny's fuming little letter about copper ingots helped lubricate the machinery of the ancient world, so tonight, as your eyelids grow heavier, and your breathing slows to match the pace of old clay being pressed into a square, let your mind drift to a quiet office in your. The air is warm. The walls are stacked with tablets. A scribe leans back and grumbles something about ink never drying when you need it to. And outside, the city hums on, unaware that future historians will obsess over this man's handwriting. You squint into the fading clay-etched light of ancient Sumer, where even the smallest mark could carry a bureaucratic thunderclap. The complaint tablets had grown into something more now. Not just passive slabs of discontent, but legally potent tools in the daily dance between citizen and state. A good complaint could topple a merchant's reputation, or delay a shipment of copper by weeks. In a culture where every agreement was written, filed, and witnessed by someone with a stylus and a grudge, letters were the courtroom of the commoner. That little square clay tile you held, it might as well be your sword. And oh, they took them seriously. By this point, Sumer's legal system was as sophisticated as its irrigation ditches. If you owned property, or goats, or even a decent batch of barley, chances were you had a case going either as the wronged or the wrongdoer. And you weren't alone. Scribes were drowning in disputes over temple misallocations, land swaps gone sideways, and traders whose silver rings turned out to be tin-touched junk. The sleepy city of Nippur, one of the oldest religious centers, had records showing dozens of these complaint letters being copied, logged, and sometimes even performed publicly. Not for fun, for justice. Yes, the Sumerians basically had public shaming through recital like ancient Yelp reviews, read aloud in the square. That merchant who shorted you on sheep. You got your tablet read by a town official in front of his shop. That's a surefire way to ruin his sales pitch. Historians still argue whether these public performances were officially sanctioned parts of the legal process, or more like an informal way to stir community accountability. Either way, the result was clear. The complaint letter had morphed from a plea into a procedural weapon. By now, a tablet like ANER-S wasn't just someone whining, it was evidence, testimony, and social signal all rolled into one. And let's not forget the not-so-glamorous downside of all this clay bureaucracy. Imagine being a clerk in one of these temples. You get to the office at sunrise, and waiting for you are rows of peasants holding tablets, some still damp from baking, each one loaded with petty frustrations. The baker sold flatbread, the herder's donkey wandered into someone's reeds again. Someone thinks the moon priest is hoarding incense. You're just trying to eat your dried fig breakfast in peace. No dice. But not all complaints were frivolous. In fact, some were harrowingly specific, like accusations of temple theft or corrupt officials skimming off tax grain. There's even a case where a man accused a priest of misusing sacred water. Sacred water. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. If that complaint was substantiated, the priest could be ousted, fined, or worse, cursed by his own gods. Quirky aside, here's one for you. Archaeologists found a peculiar tablet that was just a long list of missing chickens. The tone was grim. Each fowl was accounted for by color, feather pattern, and the name of the original owner, a weird little roll call for the barnyard. You can almost hear the farmer's panic. The speckled one with the odd comb, gone. The one that bites, gone. You'd think he was listing soldiers lost in battle. Now, let's pause and ask, why did this system endure? Why didn't people just yell at each other across the fields and move on? Well, Sumerians were obsessed with order. That Mesopotamian river life was chaotic, floods, droughts, locusts, the occasional wandering warlord, and they craved anything that brought predictability. Writing things down gave them control. It was a way to trap the chaos in clay, literally. Some historians even suggest that this legal meticulousness paved the way for later civilizations' codes, like the far more famous Hammurabi's laws, which would come a few hundred years later, in Babylon. But it's Sumer where the groundwork was laid. The complaint letter is the seed. Hammurabi's code is the oak. There's also something else at play here, something psychological. Filing a complaint, especially in writing, gives you closure. You, dear listener, probably know the feeling. You write a long, spicy email to your boss, and maybe you don't send it, but just typing it out helps. The Sumerians didn't have drafts, they baked their drafts. There was no unsending, but still, the act of carving your grievance into a tablet meant you mattered. Your problem wasn't just a whisper, it was permanent, heavy, tangible, and consider the power dynamics. Most of these letters came from people with some status, not kings, but well-off traders, scribes, or temple workers. This wasn't a free-fall complaint hotline. You needed literacy, or at least a friend who could write, and access to the clay and kilns. That's not nothing. So, in a weird way, the complaint system reinforced class structure, even as it seemed to democratize voice. By now, your mind might be drifting a bit. And that's perfectly fine. Imagine the scratch of the stylus against soft clay. The heat of the sun drying your freshly etched complaint. The smell of temple incense and the distance as a priest recites your grievance aloud, like a bedtime story gone wrong. You're wrapped in linen, watching justice unfold, not with swords, but with symbols. So next time you send a slightly annoyed customer service message, know that you're carrying on a tradition older than the wheel, older than the alphabet. A tradition born of dusty towns, petty traders, and the world's first written size. The tablet survives bare, like a message in a bottle washed ashore on the sleepy sands of modern history. This palm-sized clay relic now sits in the British Museum, silent, humble, and more than a little smug. You picture it propped under glass, looking rather like a grumpy biscuit that got left in the oven too long. But make no mistake, this is the world's first recorded customer complaint. And it's doing just fine over 3,700 years later. You let your eyes close for a second as you imagine someone, perhaps you, standing in that museum, peering down at this fragile slab, its edges chipped, its script faint in parts, as if the centuries have tried to hush it, only to fail. The cuneiform grooves still carry the voice of Nanny, the disgruntled copper trader, forever immortalized by his long-winded, exquisitely passive-aggressive tirade against the merchant Anasaur, a clay Yelp review that never got removed. Some scholars argue the tablet was never meant to be delivered at all, but rather was a kind of cathartic venting exercise, like an unsent email or a screaming match rehearsed in the shower. Others insist it was handed off with great ceremony, pressed into someone's hand with an exaggerated sigh. Give this to him, and tell him I'm not mad, just disappointed. Even the tablet's exact date remains a matter of scholarly squabble. Some place it firmly in the 18th century BCE, while others nudge it a century forward or back. That's the thing about time, you think? It blurs the edges of everything until all you have left are grooves in stone and people squinting at them under museum lights, trying to decipher anger across millennia. And yet, somehow, you understand Nanny perfectly. You've been there, maybe. Not with copper ingots or Mesopotamian trade delegations, but certainly with that one online order that arrived shattered, or the pizza that came cold, or the mysterious charge that customer service insists is your fault. Nanny's outrage is your outrage, just with more dust and less internet. Even more curious is the odd celebrity this little clay tantrum has acquired. The Anasaur complaint tablet has become a meme, a t-shirt graphic, even a punchline at dinner parties attended by history majors. It has its own reviews on Google and parody fan mail written in folkneiform. The sheer absurdity of it, that something as niche as Mesopotamian trade logistics could go viral 3,000 years later. Something in you. And isn't that the strange magic of history? That the serious becomes silly, the dry becomes deeply human, and the ancient starts to feel uncannily close. As if nothing truly disappears, but rather, everything gets recycled through laughter, bedtime stories, and museum placards. Some scholars speculate Anasaur may have been a reputable trader who simply had one bad batch. Others think he was a serial scammer, a Bronze Age online fraudster who sold bad metal with a charming smile. But the real truth, the one history refuses to pin down, is probably more mundane. Maybe he was just overworked. Maybe he had supply issues. Maybe he'd had a bad day. And Nanny, tired, sunburnt, and already missing home, just snapped. And so you arrive at the end of the road, from Sumerian canals to copper cargo ships. From meticulous scribes to dusty museum corners, you've wandered through time with your eyes half-lidded and your thoughts looping slowly. The story of a complaint letter somehow turned into a quiet lullaby, and now, here you are tucked in by bureaucracy, soothed by ancient grumbling. The grooves on the clay tablet fade to soft valleys in your mind. The bustling port of your slips behind a curtain of desert wind. You imagine the tablet, resting eternally under glass. Its message eternally mid-sentence. As if the universe pressed pause on one man's tantrum and called it history. And in this moment, every late package, every broken item, every missing refund seems oddly distant, buried under layers of silt, softened by time. You give a sleepy chuckle. Maybe tomorrow you'll write a letter of your own, not on clay, and not in cuneiform, but still a small voice in the great stream of human dissatisfaction. Now breathe slow. Let your chest rise and fall like those slow barges gliding down the Euphrates. Let your limbs grow heavy, like a porter setting down the last crate, and let the last remnants of the Sumerian sun fade into the soft whisper of wind.